Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. The UK has the worst paternity leave in Europe. At just 2 weeks statutory leave at less than half the minimum wage, we lag behind our European neighbours and are even languishing in the bottom 5 countries across the entire OECD. Today, I'm talking to George Gabriel, co-founder of The Dad Shift, a new campaign group with fairer paternity and secondary caregiver leave in their sights. George's day job is for tech giant Meta, having previously worked for Citizens UK, focused on responding to the UK's refugee crisis. Campaigner through and through, clearly, George. A subject today very close to my heart, as many of you will know. George, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here with you. Love the show and really delighted to connect.
Thank you very much for joining us. So, George, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
I think it comes from my mum. She's an inveterate campaigner. She's a really kind of powerful and proud feminist. And growing up, you couldn't miss it in the house. She set up the first all-female TV production company in the UK. She took me on demos. And she's just a big source of inspiration and definitely encouraged me and my brother to think and dream big and think and dream for others and for the world. And so, I think she gave it to us both.
No wonder you're campaigning on fair parental rights now with such a strong mother figure in your life. Is that production company still going?
I don't think so. But most recently, she ran an online discussion platform called 50/50, which is part of Open Democracy, which was a kind of great discussion center for women's movements all around the world. So I'm super proud of her and she continues to kick a bunch of ass.
Nice. Proud son. We love it. And as an adult, do you think you've become more radical or less radical? And what's been behind that? It sounds like you started quite radical with your mum's influence. So how do you see that journey?
I hope I've become more realistic with my radicalism. Not more or less, but more realistic with it. Growing up, then starting out as a campaigner, working at Citizens UK, building Safe Passage at the height of the refugee crisis. I was immensely passionate. I believed really deeply in how much things could change and how urgently they needed to. And, long story short, in 2018, Safe Passage had grown to 33 staff, 5 countries. We'd helped a couple of thousand kids reach safety. But it was intensely challenging work. At the same time, I married my first girlfriend and was rapidly discovering that we needed to get divorced. And that wasn't a good idea. And so the divorce at the same time as all the campaigning work basically just proved too much for me. And I had a big kind of period of burnout. And I think that burnout taught me to be more realistic with myself, what I can commit to, hopefully a bit more kind of humble, a bit more generous with it too. And also taught me about the need to be more realistic with others and with the world. I find as I get older, I become a bit more socially conservative. I have more and more respect for people's customs, traditions, and institutions, because I believe people have spent, years, in some case, centuries, thousands of years building these things. And normally these people are far smarter than me and have thought about it a lot longer. And so I try and kind of approach the world with a kind of greater degree of respect and with that kind of greater degree of realism, I think.
I find your kind of career trajectory very fascinating as well. When we first met, I think it might have been 2 years ago, George, possibly, we met at a conference and you were, I believe, giving a talk at the conference with someone who'd been involved in helping refugees in the Ukraine war. Is that right? And at the time you were at Meta, and I believe the talk was about how Facebook had helped those people organize. And, it might seem to people like quite a strange move from the kind of campaigning refugee third sector world to the kind of tech giant world. But when I heard you speak in that, I could kind of see the thread. Draw that thread for us.
I mean, I had always been interested in the way that technology was changing the world around us. While doing humanitarian work, focusing on how do we help this family or how do we help those 100 children, one can't help but wonder at the forces that touch millions of lives, billions of lives. So I'd always been curious about the way technology was changing things and was changing us. And so, in this big period of burnout, I was approached by a recruiter, then Facebook, and invited to work in the community partnerships team. And I needed something new environments. I needed to be learning again. And so I was really excited to take them up. I feel very fortunate to have been able to move between sectors and learn from them both. But I guess while we move and we change when we do, we don't change completely. I'm still a very values-led professional, and I want to find ways to bring that into the work I do in a day-to-day sense. And so, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw a huge humanitarian response on WhatsApp, on Facebook, and we wanted to make sure the company did everything in its power to get alongside that response and enable and support those people. What I do today and the conversation we're going to have around the dad shift and parental leave is very much something I do separate to my day job. And I'm in no way here to speak on behalf of Meta or for Meta. I'm here to speak as a dad and a person. But I'm very privileged that I've been able to find different spaces through which I can contribute to the issues I care about.
You talked about how you've potentially become a bit more socially conservative or a bit more maybe pragmatic. If we were being a bit kinder on you, a bit more pragmatic, a bit more realistic. I'm really intrigued about the fact that, companies like Meta take a lot of criticism, and justifiably so, I'm sure, in many cases. But then in other areas, they are incredibly progressive. And I think that's the link here to parental leave, because could you just share the story of your own parental leave when your daughter was born and that experience? Working for Meta, it's very different to anyone having to rely on statutory paternity leave, right?
So I was given 4 months off by my employer. I then managed to tack on extra bits in terms of holiday and so on. It was amazing. I mean, it was one of the most challenging periods of my life. People tell you it's going to be. It really was. My wife had a cesarean section. In the first kind of several weeks, you can go up and down the stairs. We live in a house with stairs. How do you get to the kitchen unless you can go up and down them? So while we were caring for our daughter in those early weeks, it was incredibly important that I could be there to support my wife as she recovered from that operation. After a couple of months, my daughter had an accident that cracked her head, and we had to rush into A&E. Horrendous. I had to wrap her up in a blanket really tightly so that she couldn't move. And then we had to put her in this X-ray machine and stand outside to try and learn whether there had been any really serious damage. And then we had to wait for like 4 hours through the night in a tiny room waiting to hear, and had a doctor come in and tell us that she had a fracture on her skull and bleeding on her brain. And it was up there with the worst few days of my life. I spent plenty of time in hospital thereafter while she recovered, and thank God she's recovered completely. 2 months in, my wife broke her leg and couldn't carry the baby at all, and suddenly I was back on carrying duty. And again, the paternity leave meant that I could be there. So I'm immensely grateful for the leave that I was given, both because how it helped me support my wife and my daughter, but also I think we aspire to have a really equal partnership in the home. And I think one of the things that stood out to me, and many parents will know is kind of quite familiar, is, the more you care for a child, the more you understand their needs, the more you understand how to meet them. And I had this sense that if I'd been back at work, there's no way I would have been particularly competent. I was barely competent as it was looking. And so really being there day to day meant I was more confident and more capable, which meant I'm more able to be a present dad for her today. So I'm very, very grateful for that time. And I think, as it went by, it just dawned on me how wide the gulf is between my experience and that of so many. And I was kind of horrified. Big picture, I think we see this trend where there have been enormous gains for gender equality over recent decades, but increasingly it's fallen to the kind of women's movement to keep going. And there's this sense that fewer and fewer men are showing up today for gender equality. And more worryingly still, there's an active backlash against it, driven by figures like Andrew Tate. And so I think in launching the Dad Shift with a group of other volunteers, what we really wanted to do was find an area of policy deeply meaningful to us and really clearly coalitional to benefit. It's good for mums, it's good for babies, it's good for dads, and just feel like, could we build some momentum and get some more fathers, men, and co-parents out behind this campaign? So that's what we're trying to do. The hope is to both change Britain's position from bottom of the league table on all of these different measures that you highlighted on your intro, and in doing so, to help kind of rebalance the conversation a bit.
Well, I think you were particularly unlucky with the events of your paternity leave. I'm sure actually a lot of people listening, it will really resonate. I mean, I can talk about my own experience. I got 6 weeks off, which is quite generous leave, especially for a small company. I remember to that moment of getting to the end of the 2 weeks that is quite standard within the sort of, office-based industry, isn't it? There's sort of 2 weeks. Getting to the end of that 2 weeks and thinking, what would be the point of me going back to work now? I was still sleeping on 2-hour shifts with my partner. My wife had a cesarean section as well, so she wasn't back up to full capacity. And my brain was just so far removed from the ins and outs of my job that, I feel like I would have been an active hindrance to my colleagues rather than any kind of gain. Because I was very grateful for that extended leave that Standing on Giants gave me. And then also, I suppose, further, the flexible working in general does come into this as well, of course, and remote options and all that kind of thing. But we're talking about the leave today. So talk to us about the problem, that gulf that you identified. What does that look like in the UK and around the world today?
As you described, the UK statutory offer is 2 weeks at less than half of the minimum wage in terms of pay. So men can take 1 week at one point during the first year of a child's life, another week at another point, and then in theory that's topped up with an arrangement introduced by the coalition government called shared parental leave. So shared parental leave basically is a system whereby the mother of the child gets whatever she gets from her employer and then has the option of taking up to a year supported at kind of very low kind of rate of pay from government. The idea is that any leave she doesn't want to use of that apportionment can be passed back to her co-parent or the father of the child, and they can take that. In reality, only 5% of men take this. It's spectacularly complex administratively, and many of your listeners running kind of medium-sized or small-sized enterprises will know this thing's an HR, just a minefield. It's incredibly complex to make happen. Many men don't know about it. And 2/3 of men who do take it, well, taking paternity leave in general, report struggling financially as a result. We still live in a society where we have a significant gender pay gap. And so in many houses, the father is still the principal breadwinner. And so it's harder for them to take time at a reduced salary. The real crushing irony of that is one of the major drivers of the gender pay gap is what they call the motherhood penalty. It is the hit to their careers and hit to progression that women take when they step out of the workforce in order to have a child. So we're in a double bind here, which is the gender pay gap. The way we can most effectively tackle it is by getting more fathers to take paternity leave. And one of the biggest barriers to them doing that is itself the gender pay gap.
I'm lucky enough to be speaking to you in the week that you've publicly launched the Dad Shift, and you did so with a slightly cheeky publicity stunt. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we went around statues around London and Edinburgh, identifying kind of famous public figures, sports people, artists, and also some of the really cool statues we have of just working people around the cities. And we popped babies on them. We popped dolls in slings and popped them on the statues, took a whole bunch of photos and video, of course, and just watched members of the public kind of engage and respond. And the response was so charming. I think many of these figures celebrate people who are known for their various contributions to public life, but their role as fathers is very rarely spoken about, very rarely celebrated. Of course, this action builds on amazing campaigning work done by Pregnant Then Screwed, who did a kind of similar action in Liverpool about a year ago. And we're delighted to kind of partner closely with them and build on the many great years they've spent campaigning for a better deal for parents in general. But yeah, it seemed to really strike a chord. So it's gone around the world. I've got people contacting me from Oz, from the US. A colleague sent me a shot of a newspaper in Delhi where it's been printed. And I think that thing of bringing the father out of these figures and using that as a way to draw attention to the fact that the UK has this appallingly bad offer for co-parents and for new dads. Yeah, just really caught the moment. Labour have committed to doing a review of parental leave policies in their first year in office. So we've kind of got our sights clearly set on it and launched with a public letter to Keir Starmer that you can find on our website, thedadshift.org. And that letter basically remembers that it really wasn't that long ago in the general election campaign that he was being pilloried for trying to protect Friday nights to spend them with his kids. We think he was right to stand up for his time with his family. And so the letter calls on him to help other dads get the time they need to spend with theirs. And yeah, we'll be excited in the next few weeks to deliver that letter to number 10 and to hopefully set this review rolling and in a good place with an ambitious vision for what can be done for dads and for families across the country.
Excellent. Anyone listening to this, that's the first thing they should do if they'd like to get involved. Go to the website and sign that letter.
Go to the website, sign the letter. We've also got a survey to get more insights, the experience of parents as they navigate that transition back to work. So we'd love people's help filling that out. I do think, particularly with your audience in mind, there's a really important space here for the voice of business. Obviously, the public finances are in a mess, and it's a major constraint on what can be achieved from a policy perspective right now. And Labour will rightly be very cognizant of the voice of business as they move into this review. So particularly with kind of values-led businesses in mind, I know some of them will already be way out in front of the pack and be offering great deals to new dads and co-parents. I know others will want to be, but will need government help to get there. I think there's a really critical space for their voices in the debate. We need to hear about the impact of knackered, demoralized, confused young dads like me and you showing up for work half-baked and not ready. We know the UK has really struggled to grow in recent years, and we know the struggle for growth is really a struggle for productivity. To be productive, you need to be healthy, you need to be well, you need to be well supported. And so I think hearing employers say that is really the thing that's going to move the needle here, help convince Labour that this is actually about betting on British dads and co-parents. It's about betting on British families in the knowledge that if we look after them, they're going to bring their best selves to work and they're going to do some amazing things. So yeah, there's a letter from business leaders that I'm hoping will be circulated through a number of different business networks. And that's an opportunity for folks to add their name, add their organization, and make sure that they're part of the kind of broader call to action for Labour to seize the moment.
Yes, look out for that. After initially telling George that I wasn't going to be involved, I agreed to circulate the letter from business through the A Little Bit Radical networks and the B Corp network. So look out for that from me. Anyone who listens to the podcast, an issue too close to my heart to say no, ultimately. I was far too busy, George, far too busy. No, it's very important. We've done a bit of naming and shaming, I'd call it, of the UK and the kind of statutory offer. A previous guest, Blair Glencorse, has an approach that really stuck with me of naming and faming, really good examples of what you want to see, of the change you want to see in the world. So I was wondering if you can talk to us about maybe some businesses that you've seen that have really fantastic offers, but then maybe on a kind of international country level as well, who's the kind of gold standard in this and that you'd like to see the UK aim for.
Totally. I mean, there's something about being bottom of the league, which is you look up and there's no shortage of examples that are better. I think, the one that springs to mind for me personally is Sweden. They offer 480 days in total per child. So if you're a single parent raising a child on your own, that's what you get at a way better rate of pay than you could expect in the UK. If you're a couple raising the child together, then each parent gets a ring-fenced 90 days, that's use it or lose it. And then they have 300 days that they can then share in a portion between them. So it's a really amazing offer. It means both partners are incentivized to take a decent amount of leave, and then they can work out what works best for them as a family. But we believe that's the kind of system that sets up families both to take the leave that's needed to recover, to bond with their kids. It means they can afford to do so. It means that they can pursue an equal approach to parenting and this new life they'll have as a family. Closer to home, as you said, there's tons of companies that are already out front in the UK doing great things. We saw this same week, Deloitte announced a really impressive enhanced offer, but it's not just in sectors where you might expect to see it. In construction, Sir Robert McAlpine have an amazing offer for new dads. Tesco have a pretty good offer for new dads. There's a whole bunch of small businesses, non-profits, charities. They're also doing great things. My old charity, Citizens UK, offer 2 months for dads. There's a whole bunch of great practice already growing. And I really do think it's a bit of a wave. At the moment, I see more and more employers coming out with enhanced offers. As a campaign, we're trying to hold those employers up to celebrate their commitments and together with them, give government a bit of a dig in the ribs and say, come on, guys, we need to do a bit better than this.
We've already mentioned it's good for productivity, it's good for well-being, but can we drill down into that a little bit more for maybe a cynical business owner, or not even cynical, just a cash-strapped business? Every pound matters. A small, medium business, every pound matters. Why parental leave? What's your answer to that? Why is that the place to spend that investment when you can't invest in every area for your team?
We think it's amazing when employers invest money in parental leave. We think it's a fantastic thing that they do, and we're seeing more and more do it. But, with our campaign, we're specifically calling on government to level up its offer. And that means government paying. So from a strict perspective, that is an added cost on business. That's to say that the work of raising healthy and happy families is the work of all of us. And therefore, we need the help of the state to do that, not just the work of employers to do what they can. So the fundamental piece here is, I think, as well as trying to drive great practice amongst employers, we really want to see policy intervention. We need to see the state stepping up to its responsibilities. In terms of individual employer kind of choices, I think there's a few different things here. The first is, I think, all employers will know this challenge of recruiting, retaining great talent. And it's very different when you're recruiting like new entry, young graduates or people who are 18, the challenges of recruitment and retention are very different. And I think there's a really strong argument to say, like when people hit that age where they're starting to talk about family, it just becomes a really determining choice of where they want to work. And so a great part of how you can attract really top talent that's in a certain demographic is by having a decent parental leave policy for both partners in any relationship. So it's partly about attracting great talent. It's partly about retaining it. I mean, you've already spoken so fondly about your employer and how important the leave they gave you was. It's an enormous loyalty and trust builder because it's such a profoundly challenging moment in people's lives. And I think if employers get alongside people in those moments in an appropriate, boundaried way, it really pays off in terms of long-term commitment. Then there's the kind of harder-edged productivity pieces, which is, to your point, most babies don't settle into a stable kind of sleeping routine for a lot longer than 2 weeks. But the first 2 weeks are carnage. The first 6 weeks, in my case, are kind of carnage. So I think the case for saying, just let people take the time they need so that when you have them, you really have them and you have the best of them. And then you can plan more sensibly from a workforce management perspective. You can say, no, realistically, this person is not going to be delivering a great deal of value for our organization right now. So let's take the appropriate steps to make sure that their workflow is managed, either by trying to absorb it elsewhere in the business or by securing the cover that's needed to make that a success. I talked about introducing the realism to radicalism. There's a realism piece here, which is like, what is the experience of working parents and how do we get the most of them? And our argument is certainly that giving better paternity leave and leave to co-parents is both good for those employees, but also good for their partners who are going to be showing up at work too and hopefully bringing their best selves.
Thank you for that answer. It's the starting point, right, of a kind of signal that you recognize the whole person, like your employees as whole people who have lives, have families. I'm thinking about the ways in which those lines have blurred in recent years. And I think the pandemic was an accelerator for this, of course. I think about the number of work calls that my son pops up on now, the number of people that know my son's name, ask me about him, the way that flexibility is recognized in the school run and flexible working, remote working, and all of that. Do you recognize that? Do you recognize parental leave? It feels almost like it's just really lagging behind where culturally we've got to, almost, especially in the professional world. Like we've sort of started to recognize our employees are whole people. They have families. We can now work flexibly and remotely to accommodate caregivers, but we've still got this awful parental leave offer. It almost feels like just this kind of dinosaur, this fossil left in the museum that's suddenly about the newest, shiniest technology. That was probably the most awful metaphor ever, but does that resonate with you?
It totally does. I mean, I think there's been a huge amount of innovation in recent years. There's definitely a changing expectation from employees about how they're going to be treated. And my bet would be those expectations are going to continue to shift as new generations come into the workforce. So I think there's a balance for businesses to strike between saying, yes, we want to treat people as whole people, set them up for success, and it's not up to businesses to take on every challenge of every employee's life. The question is our paternity offer in any way near appropriate? And I think to your point, it's just like, it's a glaring omission, isn't it? It's glaring how bad it is compared to where most of us are trying to get to on most other areas of relationship between the people working in a business and the business that's driving things forward. So yeah, I think it is a glaring omission. I think that's part of why we hit such a kind of wave of public support and why the reaction's been so immense since launching the campaign. And yeah, we believe this is going to change. And there's nothing better than getting ahead of change that's already coming.
So a year from now, where do you hope that the Downshift campaign will be, George?
My hope isn't so much for the campaign. My hope is for the cause. And my hope is that within a year, which is the timeframe Labour laid out for their review, we will have a better deal in Britain for dads and for co-parents. I would love to see dads and co-parents getting 6 weeks. I'd love to see them paid enough so they can actually take it. And I think that really is realistic within the next year. We might not get all the way to where we want in this first review because obviously, public sector finances, as we've described, are in a bit of a state. But I think we should be able to get a meaningful level up in the offer for the country. And I think we should be able to get a commitment to revisit the issue in a kind of sane timeframe. Alongside that, more and more employers will have seen this as an area to improve, an opportunity where they can make a difference. We'll be raising their voices, leveling up their offers, and we'll be in a good place. And if we played a small part in helping make some of that happen, alongside amazing organizations like the Fatherhood Institute, Pregnant Then Screwed, Fawcett Society, etc., we'd be only too proud to have played our bit.
Excellent. You jumped ahead. I was going to ask you, what's the further reading? For someone whose interest has been piqued, where else can they look for information and inspiration on this issue?
So there's a lot of great stuff coming out of the Fatherhood Institute and Pregnant Then Screwed. There's an amazing guy called Elliot Ray who leads a network called Parenting Out Loud, who I think quite a lot of your listeners may have connected with in the past. So there's a whole bunch of amazing people in the space. For folks looking for a kind of bigger picture provocation, Richard Reeves has recently released a book called, I think it's The Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling and What to Do About It. And it's a really interesting read on basically like what's going on. You know, I talked at the beginning about how men are increasingly not showing up for gender equality and worse, are being mobilized into this backlash. He's definitely bringing some really interesting insights to the table. I don't think it's the whole story, but you know, it never is. So yeah, I'd recommend that too.
Very timely. I've seen all over my LinkedIn news this week, not about fathers per se, but 18 to 24-year-old men missing from the workforce, a significantly increased percentage of young men not in education, employment or training, which is quite worrying. Sounds like that's connecting with that work that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it starts in schools. So boys fall behind girls from the first year in school, and they fall progressively further behind every continuing year in education. And the idea that flows straight through into workforce, it's unsurprising. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do, and hopefully helping dads be more present with their kids as they're raising them is one step to addressing some of these big social challenges.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I'm signed up for that. So, George, we're going to move on to the final section of the interview now, which is a little bit radical world. I mean, we've talked about a pretty significant issue for the world, I'd say. Parenting, fatherhood, pretty significant. But what's a little bit radical change for the world that you would like people to get behind that maybe you're not relentlessly campaigning for? Forgive the word relentless, by the way, if that was a bit strong.
Take it as a compliment. Take it as a compliment, Rob. Honestly, it's as I've gotten older, I really just think so much of it is about just treating each other decently. I try and live my values in some ways through the campaigning I do, but it's as much about who I am as a dad, who I am as a husband, who I am as a member of a community and a person. I find myself increasingly Buddhist these days, and I think just a bit of loving kindness out there in the world, which is like basically putting out some good vibes.
That is not an uncommon answer on this podcast in this section, actually. The power of kindness, radical kindness. I remember Jenny Kitchen from Yo-Yo talking about, and actually how difficult that is, because it's so easy and we're so role modeled actually to rush to judgment often and to rush to being a bit mean. That's what we often kind of see, and we, I think, often can jump to being defensive and these more negative reactions. So I agree with you. I think the real challenge to be kind to someone that you completely disagree with on something fundamental. I think that's the harder challenge that we should push ourselves towards, because otherwise no compromise is reached, right?
Yeah, and I think we definitely live in an age where compromise is seen as a dirty word and is frowned upon. But I think, you know, the only way to bring diverse people with diverse interests together is we have to meet in the middle. We have to learn to talk to each other, and we have to learn a way to figure out a common path forward. So yeah, I think that call to compromise is a really solid one. Sign me up, Rob. I'll join your campaign next, mate.
I'm sure Jenny would be up for starting that for sure, and a few of these other guests. So last question is always the same, George. So if there's someone out there listening to this podcast and, you know, never ceases to amaze me, lots of you do listen. Thank you very much. Love every single one of you. If there's someone listening who has little bit of a radical idea, perhaps for business or a change in their life, or you being our guest today, perhaps a campaign, a cause that they really care about, but they're not quite sure where to get started, what would your advice to them be on those first steps to take?
Start. You make the road while walking it. I think radicalism, I think candor, I think kindness, you know, we often think of these as like attributes we have or we don't have. Really, these are muscles that we do or do not build. And the only way to build a muscle, which is about taking action, whether it's starting a new business, pushing out action on a cause, or making some change in your life, is to begin trying to do it. And I think if we can start, and if we can be generous with ourselves as we do, knowing not every step's going to be on the path and we're going to falter and we're going to fumble, so much the better. So yeah, start, show yourself some grace, and yeah, find some great people to do it with.
Excellent. George, thank you so much for joining us today. Hope to speak to you again soon.
Pleasure, Rob. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.